Hi, and welcome to episode 3 and the final part of COVID-19 in the Black Diaspora. I'm your host, Pastor Morgan, and this is a podcast in conjunction with Iowa Coalition for Collective Change and Ethnic Minorities of Burma Advocacy and Resource Center. Now, over the first 3 podcasts, we talked about 3 different things when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccine. In the first episode, we talked about the history of the abusive history of the Black community and the American medicine. And then we talked about in episode 2, if you want to go, if you watched it, or if you listened to it, or if you want to go back and listen to it, we talked about the African traditions and the roles they played in the American modern American vaccines. And so today we're going to talk about, after talking about those 2 subjects and the dismissal of Black people, the abusive relationship with America, with the American medical community, and how they have had an abusive relationship and been abusive of Black people and Black bodies for years. Why then? Why should we get this vaccine? We're going to begin by talking about what is coronavirus. Coronavirus is a variation of the SARS virus, and SARS virus is something that we became aware of when there was an outbreak, a global outbreak, in a few different countries in 2000. So in 2000, because the reason we're talking about this is because this is one of the reasons that there is some hesitancy in all communities, is how did they come up with a vaccine so fast? We realized what coronavirus was sometime in October in China, and it was on the shores of America by, they're saying February 3rd, but there are reports of even earlier, of 2020. So the vaccine starting to come out in between June and September of 2021 was very soon for a lot of people, and they didn't quite understand or grasp how that happened so very fast. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But let's first talk about vaccines in general. All right. So all of us, most of us, the majority of us have some sort of vaccine, whether it's the Hib vaccine, tetanus, polio, smallpox. We have some sort of vaccine in our system already. Coronavirus is a variation of the SARS virus. And because of that 2000 outbreak, there was another vaccine created to minimize the effects or immunize the population against this deadly virus. Because most of us have some sort of vaccine in us already, we have been vaccinated. And so we have, whether it was us to go to college or whether it was our parents in order to get us in school or just to protect us against these diseases, made the choice to have us vaccinated. So we do have some sort of vaccination, the majority of us. So yes, even though this is a different type of vaccination or a new vaccination, it's not something that most of us are unfamiliar with, the process of being vaccinated. So now let's talk about this vaccination. All right. So one of the reasons why this was created so quickly, as people, and it was quick from the time that we realized what coronavirus was, and it was taking over our daily lives to the time that the vaccine was created, faster than any other vaccine, because most of us, it's not a global thing when a new vaccine is created, and it's not as urgent. So the push isn't as strong, and we're not really familiar with about how long it takes. Some of us are familiar with how long it takes, and so it was still a little quick. But one of the reasons it was, or the main reason it was, is because, let's explain this, and it's not for everyone. If you understand this on a higher level, that's great. But for those who may not, we're going to break it down to a base level that everybody can understand. So imagine this vaccine like a cake mix, right? So in 2000, when the SARS outbreak happened, they understood that SARS was this thing that could happen, and so they began making some sort of immunization against it, right? Some sort of protection against it. Now, if you imagine this like a cake, that means that they took the flour, they already had the flour, the sugar, the eggs, the oil, they already had all that stuff together, and all they were really waiting for was to figure out what flavor cake it was going to be, whether it was going to be vanilla, chocolate, spice, etc. So once they realized what the flavoring was going to be, which in this case would be COVID-19 or this corona, the first version of the coronavirus, then that was the flavoring. So then it took them about a year to get the flavoring just right. And that year, that's when it started to be released to the public. But they had 20 years of making sure that the flour was already just right, and that the eggs, they had just enough eggs, and that they had just enough sugar. So they had 20 years of preparation, and all they were waiting for was the flavoring of this cake, and to make it very specific. So that's what they did when they realized, and they had a year to break down to find coronavirus, because at this time people are getting tested. It's global. So there's all of these scientists, all of these labs working on this one project, because this is the biggest thing right now that is the threat to humanity. So they're all working on this one project. They're all working to find out exactly what flavor this cake is. And so they break it down in all the different ways of the scientists that I can't speak on because I am not a scientist, but in all the different ways the scientists break things up and break it down to its nuclear level. And then they figured out the flavor. And then once they figured out the flavor, they built it back up so that they had just the right flavor. And within a year, there was a vaccine that was specific to this flavor or to this infection. So that is pretty much the quickest and easiest way that I have seen it be explained, and to explain it. So that everybody kind of gets it. And that's why the vaccine was created, and what people feel was a very, very quick turnaround. Okay, so again, with all of the history of the American medical community and Black people, what's different this time? What is different about this? What is to say this isn't another trick by the government or something else to affect the Black community? Well, number one, let's talk about it. Let's think about it. Number one, it was distributed to rich, influential, or quote unquote powerful people first, which is the opposite of the way that things are normally work. Even if you think about the smallpox vaccine that we talked about in the last episode, and the fact that it was tried on enslaved people first. Even to this day, most medications and new vaccinations are tried on the most vulnerable of our population, the houseless population, the incarcerated population. So when they're not sure, they're not trying it on the people that they consider the most important. They're trying it on the ones that they consider the least important. And the fact that the first people to get this vaccine were the ones that society considers the most important, says that this is different than the other times. Rich people lied to get it. There's a few different examples, but one in particular was a couple in Canada that they were doing a program for Indigenous people, and they lied and said that they were domestic workers in order to get in line to receive this vaccine before anybody else. That's not something that happens when it's iffy, or when people aren't sure that this is at least the safest route. Um, let's talk about and this is one of the biggest ones. One of the biggest ones is the amount of people who have received it, the sample size of the demographics, right? So the sample size is, when you're doing research, the sample size is what you use to judge the efficacy of whatever it is, of the product, of the experiment, of the medication in this particular in the vaccination in this particular instance. And the bigger the sample size, the better data you have to back up your claim of whether it immunizes or whether it cures or whatever you're claiming. But in this case, whether it is effective in its immunization. So that's the larger the sample size, the better the better data you receive. Because of this sample size, because this was a global pandemic, and because this was something that was distributed to billions, literally, of people, you have the largest sample size of any vaccination that you have ever had in the history of vaccinations. So, whether in that sample size, that diversity of samples, and not only the size of the sample, but the diversity of the sample. So the diversity of the people that were included is one of the greatest, because it covered differences in physical, ethnic, age, and gender diversity, socioeconomic and geographical backgrounds, different health backgrounds, both history and care, and the amount of people are compared to any other vaccine that we have already received. A couple that we talked about at the very beginning of this podcast, all of it is that is the largest of any of those. It is probably the largest in history, to be very honest, judging by the numbers. And this is why. So the last real data to come in about smallpox, and we're going to talk about smallpox because smallpox is the only other vaccine that was as worked on and as widely distributed, which is globally. So let's talk a little bit about these demographics. So smallpox was distributed worldwide over a period of hundreds of years, but we're going to use that in this example. So worldwide, in the population of the last time that smallpox was known to be given as a global vaccine was 1977. In 1977, the world population was 4.3 million people. In that time, 80% of the population was given the smallpox vaccine. That amounts to about 3.4 million people. In 2021, there were 7.8 million people in the world. And of those people, 69.9% received at least one dose, and 64.3% received at least two doses. So that means 5.1 million people in the 5.1 billion people. All of these are billions. The population in 1977 was 4.3 billion people, and the population in 2021 was 7.8 billion people. So that meant in 1977, 3.4 billion people were vaccinated against smallpox. And in 2021, 5.1 billion people were fully vaccinated against COVID-19. So that is more people, even though the percentage is less at 64.3 compared to the 80%, the amount of people is actually almost 2 million more people, 2 billion more people were vaccinated in 2021 against COVID-19 as compared to smallpox in 1977. So basically, what that adds up to is, from a scientific and research standpoint, the COVID-19 vaccine is probably the safest vaccine that you will have ever received. From a historical standpoint, this is different than many times that the medical community, specifically the American medical community, have used Black bodies as pawns, curiosity, or guinea pigs in the pursuit of science or health, for three main reasons. First, it wasn't done in secret, right? Which historically is how they've operated since the abolishment of slavery. When they are out to do underhanded things or to hurt the Black community, it's a secret event. It may come out, but they don't openly do that. From Henrietta Lacks changing her name to Henrietta Lane, to telling the people, keeping out of the press that they were not treating the people in the Tuskegee experiment, or the fact that they were keeping them from being treated and keeping it all a secret that they weren't being treated. And that is that is another thing that is different about their distribution of this vaccine compared to the historical abuse that the Black community has faced. Second, it was given to the elite first. And again, historically, this isn't normally the way it happens. It happens the other way around, like we were talking about with the smallpox vaccine and being given to enslaved people first. Third, and lastly, the sample size and diversity alone is the best that we have ever had in history of vaccines on sheer number size. That means that if or when you receive the vaccine, someone who is remarkably similar to you in both makeup and background has probably already had it. And if we take into account the small percentage of people who have had severe side effects, the overwhelming chances are that it is safe for you. Um, so the bottom line in this, and this podcast is not going to be as long as the other ones. The other ones were almost an hour, but we have gone over a lot of things and we've talked about a lot of reasons, whether it be hesitancy or the systemic issues that are faced by Black communities and healthcare inequity, and in Black community infrastructure, even if it comes with medical infrastructure. Um, we have talked enough about those and we've addressed those concerns that we now it's really just about making informed choice. You're going to make the decision based on what you feel is right for yourself and your family. And so this podcast series was really to give you information to help you make a very well informed decision so that we acknowledge and the concerns that the Black community has about COVID-19, that we acknowledge the concerns they have about the American medical community and how it has been dealt with. It has dealt with the Black community historically and in the present, and that we talk about it and point it out, and then talk about this vaccine and kind of compare and contrast so that it's a pros cons list, really, so that you can make the very best decision that you possibly can for yourself and your family. And so that was the point of this. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a little something new. I hope it gave you something to think about. And more than anything, I hope that you are settled in the decision you make for you and your loved ones. So again, I'm Pasha Morgan. This has been a Health and Equity podcast from Iowa Coalition for Collective Change in conjunction with Ethnic Minorities of Burma Advocacy and Resource Center. All of the links for the things that in the articles that I've referenced will be in the description. Thank you so very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this. I've enjoyed my time with you. Have a good one. Be safe.